Welcome to the Crux of Cardio. I'm Jordan Bergen, Head of Cardiovascular at Crux. In 2024, I very nearly suffered a cardiac arrest due to an underlying illness. It was unexpected and it fundamentally changed how I look at the industry. Since joining Crux, my role has been simple but ambitious in practice: to strengthen the cardiovascular ecosystem by supporting the people building it through talent, through fundraising and through community. Helping founders, executive clinicians and investors connect in ways that genuinely move the needle. We started the Crux of Cardio to spotlight the incredible work happening across the cardiovascular space, the technologies, the teams, the setbacks and the breakthroughs, and most importantly, the very real patient impact behind it all. I hope you enjoy this episode. Hi there, I'm Jordan from Crux, and today we have Acorai, and I'm joined by their CEO, Filip Peters. Filip, would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, pleased to be here. My name is Filip Peters, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Acorai.
Brilliant. And so Filip, you started your career in a very different version to what a lot of people do in medtech. I believe you came out of finance and machine learning rather than traditional medtech. Tell me a little bit about that. What motivated you to move into healthcare technology?
Yeah, and it's probably not the most obvious transition, right? I think the one common factor there is the machine learning part, and looking at time series machine learning. Whether it's stock prices or whether it's time series data from sensor data, the methods that you use to analyze that data are fairly similar. So there was a bit of crossover there. But finance is finance, right? I think you're solving very interesting problems. But at the end of the day, there's sometimes the feeling that you're just moving around capital, right? And I think healthcare has a no shortage of problems to be solved. And I just had the opportunity to peek into that world, and once I did, I've been in it now for 6 years, so haven't really looked back. It's been a busy journey.
As you mentioned, there's so many problems to be solved, and heart failure is definitely one of the biggest problems right now. What was the specific moment then? You said that you had a peek into the healthcare market. What was that moment?
Yeah, so for better or worse, I come from a family of medtech entrepreneurs. So whether that's my father or my cousins or my uncles, everyone seems to have dabbled in medtech entrepreneurship at some point in their lives. And I became aware of the problem that we're solving today. So the ability to non-invasively assess the cardiac and pulmonary pressures, and we'll get into that later, why that's important, through a company in Israel that was trying to do this with ultrasound, and the graveyard of ultrasound-based approaches to this problem is pretty large. But looking at the space and kind of coming in from an outsider's perspective, and having a bit of a entrepreneurial naivety to me, I think allowed me to just sort of look at it a bit differently and say, hey, maybe there are other technologies out there that we could use. Maybe there's inspiration from other industries that we could take, and try and build something from scratch that could enable us to do this. And of course, I grossly underestimated the challenges of doing something like that. But here we are 6 years later, and it looks like we succeeded in doing that, right? And the trick was looking outside of healthcare for inspiration, right? So we read the scientific literature for any form of non-invasive way of approximating pressures and fluid dynamics in different systems. Found a lot of interesting research in the oil and gas industry, particularly in the US. Found a lot of interesting literature in any form of engine diagnostics or machine diagnostics, elevated diagnostics, in fact. So really any system where you are trying to detect weak signal in an otherwise noisy system, and weak deviations from the expected normal, which is effectively what we're doing when we're looking at the heart. It's a very noisy system, and there are many minor weak deviations that have important signal. So took a bunch of those insights and put it into what was a very crude early prototype. And luckily, we found some of the world's leading heart failure specialists to support us on this journey, and we're able to run studies in Sweden and in the UK, and get sort of that early feasibility data and evidence going. So um, many redesigns later as well, right? We finally ended up at what's the final product, and we'll be heading to the market soon, which we're very excited about.
Amazing. I want to zoom back in on something. I don't know whether you can share it or not. What you mentioned, there was a company from Israel, an ultrasound company that gave you a bit of inspiration for this. Could you share what company that was?
Yeah, so it wasn't a company per se. So there was some early research from a university that was coming out, and there's been a few different companies in this space, in the ultrasound space, and um, their names escape me right now. Um, I mean, they all start with Echo Cardio something, right? But
There's definitely a few there. But I can't help you there because there's 5 or 6 definitely. Cool, cool. Well, look, let's move back into what we was continued in. So take me back to 2019. I believe that's when you guys was founded. What did those early days look like for the business?
yeah, so we founded 2019. A couple months later, COVID hit in 2020 March there. And you know, we were lucky in the sense that we were in Sweden. So as you may recall, things stayed open pretty much in Sweden, including clinical trials. So we were able to run clinical studies all throughout that period. Um, it's really the first year or two was just really about me sitting in the garage and building a bunch of prototypes and trying to make them look less crude with each iteration, right? But um, there was a few different aha moments, right? Realizing that um, clinical workflow friction has been the killer of many great technologies in the medical device space, and building a device that is as streamlined as possible and as easy to use as possible and has minimal workflow friction was always a priority from the start. In addition to providing these very important insights on the cardiac and pulmonary pressures, and um, so these cardiac and pulmonary pressures, right? They are effectively the blood pressure inside the different chambers of the heart, and they have been shown in many studies to be very helpful when it comes to managing and treating heart failure patients. And it's sort of been the holy grail for many decades within cardiology to figure out a good way of non-invasively estimating these. There are non-invasive ways of approximating these pressures today, right? So typically, if you're a heart failure specialist today, you will use a combination of echocardiography, blood-based biomarkers, X-ray, physical symptom assessment, and although they do provide a reasonable estimate of whether the patient is congested or not, so if they have high pressures or low pressures, these tools do remain subjective. They're often lagging of symptoms, so they're lagging indicators, and they tend to vary between whoever's doing that assessment, right? So there's many studies that have shown that if you put two heart failure specialists in the same room, they will more often than not come out with you know the same estimate of these pressures, right? So we're just trying to get rid of that workflow friction. So just making sure that the device that we have is first of all accurate and validated against the clinical gold standard, which is a right heart catheterization procedure, but making sure that it's super easy to use, that it's repeatable. You can hand it to a nurse or a heart failure specialist, doesn't matter who it is that's using it, they will come back with the same result, to make sure that there is no variability in that assessment over time.
Amazing. Any sort of early challenges or breakthroughs that shape the direction of the business today?
Yeah, I mean, where do we start, right? Um, I think hardware is hard, as they say, right? It's a cliche, but it is very true. We looked at the hardware that was out there and at the time, and we're considering, do we use something that's exists off the shelf, or do we build something of our own? And we for better or worse, we ended up building something of our own because we felt that um, the infrastructure wasn't there to collect data with a high enough fidelity to enable machine learning to find patterns in this data, right? So um, I think that's been a huge challenge, right? We've been through 3 design iterations with a device, pre even getting to the market. So that has taken a lot of resources and a lot of time. But we've learned a ton from every redesign, and I think what we have now is just a really solid device that's gonna be the foundation of this company for many years to come. I think COVID was obviously a challenge, both in terms of um, managing what was already then a virtual and global organization, but understanding firsthand the challenges of any supply chain disruption. I think that's really set a mark on me personally, and planning for that risk in the future has been very important. One of the main challenges that we've had as founders is coming from the outside and perhaps relying too much on people with more experience from the space. I think there's great opportunity in relying on other people's experience, but there's also great danger in that because many experienced people assume that they will know things in a seemingly similar space, but even even two companies in the same disease space can have very different clinical workflows and very different incentives, right? So as I think we learned perhaps a little bit too late to rely more on our gut feeling and take things more from a sort of first principles approach, and that's led us down some pathways, I think, in the past that weren't the right ones, and I think going forward we've taken a much more of a first principles approach, and knowing that we'll make many more mistakes in the future, but I think it's about learning from those mistakes as quickly as possible, and moving on as quickly as possible.
Absolutely. And those other pathways that you went down, does that mean that the mission has evolved or changed from day one to what it is now, or has it always been a similar statement of mission?
Yeah, so I don't think the mission has changed, right? I think it's always about helping patients, and the way we do that specifically is by helping healthcare professionals better navigate their patients. All right. So I think we've always been clear about that. But more and more we started focusing on this in-hospital use case. So specifically looking at the hospitalized heart failure patient workflow, which we think is very much overlooked. And there's been trends, and it's been very popular to talk about remote patient monitoring for many years. And I think in interactions with many different stakeholders and investors, etc., that was always sort of the default mode that we should be going after remote patient monitoring, because that's what effectively everyone else is doing, and that's what other companies in the space have done. And it, I think, took us a little bit too long, in my opinion. I say that about a lot of things, though, but to get to a point where we truly understood where we can have the most impact and where our value proposition is the strongest, which is we believe to be in the inpatient workflow.
Amazing. Well, thank you for going into depth there. We kind of touched on the current standard of care before, so I believe that's Abbott's CardioMEMS device and maybe Endotronix's device. Can you go into a little bit more depth on how your device truly works and how that looks different to their devices?
Yeah. So two things there, right? We're different from a technology perspective,
Yep.
in the fact that we are non-invasive. Just for the audience, a quick recap there. Um, Both CardioMEMS and Cordella, which is Endotronix, now owned by Edwards, and CardioMEMS is owned by Abbott. They are implantable pulmonary artery pressure sensors. So they are MEM sensors that you put into the heart, permanently implanted, and they give the physician, or whoever is managing that data, information about the patient's pulmonary artery pressure. And CardioMEMS, they ran a very robust and very large clinical study called the Champion Study, which was the pivotal study in this space, showing that they could reduce both readmission rates and mortality rates by upwards of 50%. All right, some really, really astonishing results, and they really cemented the value that pulmonary pressure monitoring and in general, cardiac and pulmonary pressure monitoring has when it comes to managing heart failure. And I think originally as a company, we were sorry, hey, we're going to be the non-invasive CardioMEMS, right? And then when you start looking into the mechanics of getting paid for such a product, things get a little bit more complex. There isn't a whole lot of reimbursement out there. I think with anything remote, you have patient compliance issues, you have physician compliance issues of actually looking at the data, you have healthcare professional concerns about being bombarded with too much data. All these kind of things started popping up as sort of small points of friction in that commercial pathway that we just didn't love. And we looked at our device and we sort of said, why haven't we considered the inpatient market as our beachhead market, right? Why isn't that? And the more we dig into it, and sort of every day that the company keeps going, the more excited we are about that workflow. And that is the other big difference, right? So technology wise, but also workflow wise. So whereas Endotronix and CardioMEMS are targeting the remote patient monitoring side of the heart failure journey, we are exclusively focused on the inpatient journey for now. And the reason we like it is that you have existing reimbursement for these patients, right? So there are 3 DRG codes in the US for a heart failure hospitalization, and all economic incentives are aligned to solve and improve this workflow, and that really comes from 3 different levers, I should say. One is reducing admissions is a great importance in this workflow. The other is reducing cost of care once they've been hospitalized, and the third, and I think very familiar to most of the audience, will be readmission reduction. The fact of the matter is that most hospitals in the US lose money on every admission for heart failure, so to the tune of about $2,250 per admission, which means that you want to avoid admitting these patients in the first place if you can. There's literature pointing to that we can possibly manage as many as 50% of those that get admitted could be managed in some other non-acute setting. So either that's a step-down clinic or a hospital at home program or sort of a hospital to home program. So we believe we can be a big part of that workflow emerging. The other, of course, is reducing costs of managing these patients once they have been admitted. And there are a few different ways we believe we can do that. One is by offering healthcare professionals a tool to better understand these patients. We can allow them to make better decisions on both diuretic adjustments, but also GDMT optimization, which has the potential to get these patients to a stable level faster and to decongest these patients faster. So taking them from a high level of pressure to a low level of pressure in a more timely manner, which is just another way of saying that we can potentially reduce length of stay. And every point of a decimal that we can shave off the length of stay for a hospital is very interesting financially. The third and final, and perhaps the most important part of this, is making sure that these patients are on fully optimized GDMT to whatever extent that's possible, and making sure that they're fully decongested so that there is no residual congestion, as it's called, which we know is one of the main drivers of high readmission rates. And the reason that's important is because currently a large proportion of patients are being discharged when they have residual congestion. So they tend to feel fine, they tend to look fine, but they still have these high pressures, which is a major driver for readmissions sort of within that first 7-day period. So for us as a company, readmission rate reduction is a two-part story. On the one hand, you have the remote patient monitoring products out there who play a very important role in preventing readmission over the long term. And on the other end, you have companies such as Acorai, where we ensure that we're not discharging patients that are not fit for discharge. And we make sure that we're optimizing their therapy as much as possible when they're in the hospital to avoid them coming back to the hospital just a few days later. So, just to summarize, reducing admissions in the first place because they're not profitable patients, reducing the cost of care once they're in the hospital, and reducing readmission rates by making sure that these patients are on optimized the guideline directed medical therapy and they're optimally decongested prior to discharge. And that's really why we like this workflow, because we think we have a very clear way of really addressing all stakeholders' concerns in this problem.
Understood. And what are the clinical advantages of this non-invasive approach that you guys have compared to like invasive catheterization or implanted sensors?
So the first and most obvious one is probably that it's non-invasive, right?
Yeah.
But I think the perhaps most interesting one, which we don't often think about, is machine learning allows us to look at the data in different ways, right? So, for example, in our case, there are different pressures inside the heart, and we can train different models to learn different characteristics of the different sides of the heart. And if we look at Acorai's products that we're bringing to the market, it will not just be able to look at one parameter of the heart, which is the case for an implantable sensors. It's by definition in one part of the heart, and it can measure one thing inside the heart. So for Acorai's purposes, right, we are looking at both left-sided and right-sided pressures. So in this case, pulmonary capillary wedge pressure and right atrial pressure, which allows you to get a much better and a much holistic view of the patient's condition. And this is important because in many times these pressures are discordant. So in our data, which we presented earlier this year, from a large cohort of patients undergoing right heart catheterization, which is the gold standard, about 25% of patients had discordant pressures, where one is saying it's high and the other is saying it's low. And if you don't have access to both of these, as a physician, you may not be optimizing therapy as well as you could have. So that's obviously an important aspect. The third benefit of something like this is just the ability to do it whenever you need to do it, right? I think in the ideal world, we would put a right heart cath in all patients coming into the hospital and be able to monitor them as frequently as possible, but it's just not feasible from a safety and an economic standpoint. And with our device, this will be effectively as easy as using your stethoscope, and you will get a hemodynamic assessment of your patients in no time. And that has tremendous implications from a health economic perspective. The perhaps last thing I'd like to mention is just the unit economics of a device that is by definition able to be used on multiple patients during the hospital stay, instead of just one device per patient. That just gets the unit economics of something like this down to some very attractive levels, and that is why we like this inpatient use case, because the ROI that we can provide hospitals on with a device such as this are pretty extraordinary.
Can I ask how extraordinary, or is it something that we can't go into too much detail with?
So no, I mean we could talk about that. I think even on a conservative day, we end up at sort of 20x the annual price of the device, right? And I think that's when we sort of stop doing the analysis, and because there's many different levers we can pull in terms of driving better returns for hospitals. And of course, it will differ from hospital to hospital depending on the types of patients they have. But there are some pretty extraordinary savings to be had with this device.
Amazing. And we've heard lots of good so far, loads of really, really, really amazing stuff. But what's been the most difficult technical or clinical challenge that you guys have faced so far?
So yeah, where do we start? I mean, we've talked about the building hardware is hard, right? I think that's been a recurring theme for us in the sense that every workflow is different, and you learn. We had a very large study of 1,600 patients across 20 hospitals in 6 different countries. So there was a lot of different sources of noise, so to speak, that we had to deal with. And whether that is, the user placing the device in the wrong way, or whether that is someone listening to Beyonce in the background, despite being told to be quiet. Those were definitely challenges that we had to embed into sort of this final version of the product to make sure that we can handle misuse, so to speak. And that just took a lot of time. Similarly, this is a little bit of a difficult space from a data perspective, in that the gold standard, which is a right heart catheterization, perhaps isn't so golden, right? And what does that mean, right? So there is inherent measurement error to the right heart catheterization procedure, and there is inherent variability between sites, despite being a pretty standardized process. So we had a core lab that looked at all of these right heart cath tracings and either adjusted the pressures upward or downwards depending on, based on this independent assessment. Because there is a bit of discretionary, the sites themselves report the pressures, right? And that's not always done in the standardized manner. So that means that the variability between sites can actually be quite high. And we have a paper coming out on this, which I think will be interesting for a lot of people. But this also goes into sort of the issues when you're talking to regulatory bodies about what is the accuracy that a device such as this needs to have. And we're probably sitting on the world's largest adjudicated right heart catheterization set. So we know the most about the inherent variability of the gold standard. So there was a piece of learning how to engage with regulators and how to communicate with them, and how to educate them about the true nature of what we're trying to build and what existing standard of care actually looks like.
Let's dive into that a little bit. I think one of the biggest topics at the moment when I speak with people is their current experiences working with regulators in both the US and Europe. How have you guys found that?
Yeah, it's been mixed. I think the US is fantastic in the sense that you have the FDA Breakthrough Device designation, which we were lucky to receive in 2023. We also joined a TAP pilot, right, which allows us to have frequent dialogue with the FDA, so on a bi-weekly basis, essentially. And that's been a great way of engaging both informally and formally with the FDA on matters, you know, on clinical study design to anything else pertaining to how we want to validate the device, right? So that's been really good. I think whenever you're building something new, there will be a little bit more discussion than just doing a regular 510(k), right? So I think those discussions have taken time. I think this is also where we perhaps trusted people with more experience in the past a little bit more about how to communicate with the FDA, and I think we've learned our lesson there in terms of the TAP pilots, which the FDA runs, is just a really great program where I think companies benefit from putting sort of all the cards on the table and being very upfront about what we're trying to do. It's a very collaborative process, is what we found. I think once we adjusted our way of communication. Europe is a little bit of a nightmare. MDR has made it very difficult to innovate, I should say. We were lucky to be able to run our first study under MDD. But I mean, now you have MDR, which doesn't seem to be taking into account how one is to build an AI-enabled device from scratch. And on top of that, you have 27 different medical agencies in each country that takes their own interpretation of MDR. And if you want to run a study in Europe, you need to get through all of those and they have wildly differing opinions about how to interpret MDR. So that is a challenge. And then reimbursement in Europe is a lot more uncertain, right? So, but manageable, I would say. It's not rocket science. It's just about getting through it.
I'm interrupting this episode to bring you a word from our sponsors, TTP. TTP is a leader in complex medical technology development with deep scientific and engineering expertise. They support ambitious medtech companies in solving high-risk, high-complexity challenges where there's no margin for error. Whether you're tackling uncharted technical territory or racing to bring a product to market, TTP provide clarity and direction. By de-risking innovation and ensuring seamless alignment with regulatory and manufacturing demands, TTP help you move forward with speed and confidence. To find out more, check out the show notes.
Interesting. So the only thing harder than getting EU MDR right now on board is fundraising. How's that been going for you guys? I saw you looking very busy at MedTech Malta. Between calls, meetings, I saw you sat on Teams as well. Looked like you was non-stop.
Yeah, it's the job of a CEO, right? Here, stay funded. I mean, we've been lucky to attract so some really great investors, right? So we have pharma companies represented, we have health systems on our cap table, we have healthcare VCs, medical device distributors, and high net worth individuals. So we've been very lucky in the past years to attract what's over $50 million US in capital and grants on top of that, right? So we have this EIC accelerator in Europe, as you're aware of, which is a great supporter of startups. Things are very different, I think, today compared to what they were, I think, even 2 years ago. So funds are really feeling the difficulties of fundraising as well. So I think while we are seeing a lot of interest, and a lot of my founder friends echo this observation, right? But there's a lot of interest from funds, but I think a lot of funds are compelled to keep capital for their portfolio companies who may not be doing so well. So there is a little bit of a inefficiency, I think, right now in the fundraising market. With that said, there are a lot of interesting, I think, players that are stepping in. We're seeing a lot more interest from health system venture funds, and I think you may have seen that MedTech Malta. There was quite a few U.S. health systems that have made the trip over to Malta. So I think they're stepping up, and I think there's natural fit there, particularly kind of for cases such as Acorai, where the value proposition is so obvious for the hospital itself. It just makes a lot of sense. But yeah, it's about staying creative about how you stay funded. And luckily we do have supportive investors that are able to take us all the way to market. So we have that going for ourselves, because there's a lot of our competitors that have gone out of business for lack of funding, and it's a shame, because they're mostly good technologies, right? It's more a question of convincing investors that there's a commercial case for that particular product.
And what do you think the biggest thing is convincing your investors to back Acorai?
So I think, I mean, having a clear commercial story is always the case, right? Very rarely do we get pushback on the technology or the clinical validation, and I think it's more about having a very clear commercial story and clear value proposition to the market, and being able to show that this is not just a nice shiny new toy that's going to be adopted at one or two academic centers, but this is a product that will be category defining and can be applied across all of the hospitals in the US and across the world, right? And I think that's what we've done very well, more and more, I think, over the last year, just getting that go-to-market and beachhead market story very clearly laid out, and having a credible plan to validate that from a health economic and an outcome perspective, which is what our upcoming pivotal study will do, right? Which the HOSPHF study is what we're calling it, and that will be a 1,000-patient study across 3 continents, so US, Europe, and Asia. And the goal is to show that patients that had better decongestion as measured by the Acorai device, so they were better stabilized, and had better therapy optimization. Those patients have better outcomes in the form of lower readmission rates, fewer adverse event rates and mortality rates, etc. And that's what we're looking to prove out over the coming 2 quarters. And I think that's going to be a real game changer of a study in terms of, I think, really for the first time being able to show that a tool can be integrated into the clinical workflow and really drive better decision making in this patient group, which will be able to be protocolized in the future into something that hopefully anyone can do.
Amazing. And you sort of led into a nice bit of an area that we could talk about here. So what is your go-to-market strategy?
Yeah, so I mean, we're very focused on the US market. And again, we're very much focused on the hospitalized heart failure patient workflow. In most cases, these patients get managed in some form of cardiac ward or by internal medicine. In about 20% of cases, these are managed kind of in the cardiac care unit or ICU units. We are targeting operational expense budgets around the US. So our pricing is such that we want to fit into those operational expense budgets, selling directly to the clinics themselves. And what's nice about this is that the KOLs that we're engaging with do have a large ability to drive a buying decision. And again, just going back to the fact that we are addressing the incentives of a lot of these stakeholders. So there is no stepping on anyone's revenue toes. There is minimal workflow friction, and everyone seems aligned to solve the problem, which is why we like the US. There's a lot of complaints about the US health system as a whole, but I think for the hospitalized heart failure patient workflow, at least, it seems that it is incentivizing companies like us to solve problems, right? So I think it does work there.
And oh, go on, you can continue.
No, I was just going to mention, I think in terms of how this gets piloted versus how this gets scaled up from a distribution perspective, time will tell, right? We will definitely be going to market ourselves initially to demonstrate that this can be sold to most health systems in the US, and we can penetrate these health systems quite deeply. With that said, these are typically quite sticky call points where you have a few established players that typically have a broader set of products. So there are a few natural distribution partners out there for us that could that could cross sell something like Acorai pretty easily, we think. So that is sort of the North Star of finding the right commercialization partner for something like this in the US.
Amazing. And apologies if I'm barking at the wrong tree here. Does that mean that eventually you would be acquired rather than going down the IPO route?
So I think, in medical devices, that is the most natural route most of the time. And again, I think because we are targeting pretty difficult call points, that could be a natural avenue for us. Whether it's a long-term commercialization partnership or whether it's an acquisition, I don't think that matters much. But in the case where we would need to build out, a global sales force ourselves, we would either need to find pretty deep pockets in terms of private equity capital or do an IPO to raise that capital, right? So I think in that scenario that would be a case, but we're not closing any doors yet on any avenue because we don't need to, right? So I think there's still time to figure it out.
Cool. One of the things that you mentioned is that you've been lucky enough to have great investors, and you've got great investors on your seats. You've also got a great advisory board as well, which I noticed, and one of them was a podcast guest in Patrick.
Yeah.
Tell me how helpful those guys have been in both regions, in both the investor world and the advisory board. How pivotal have they been for the company?
I mean, I would say very. So, one of our investors is Cedar Sinai Ventures, and I think they have been fantastic in the way that they have tried to integrate us into their ecosystem, and the goal of they are the very definition of a strategic investor, right? I think that's been great. I think on the advisory side, we have some really great heart failure specialists on board. Dr. Andrew Sauer at St. Luke's, who headed up our Capture HF study. He's just a great voice in the field. And Dr. Ryan Tedford at MUSC and Murat Fadim at Duke, right? These are sort of internally we call them the heart failure mafia. But they are just able to think about things not just from their own perhaps academic perspectives, but try and understand the commercial implications of different product choices that we do, and also how this thing gets scaled up en masse in the US. And of course, shout out to Patrick Schnegelsberg, who's our chairman of the board. And I think Patrick is unique in that sense that he has experience from both larger medtech companies and is one of the most knowledgeable guys in the heart failure space from a commercial perspective, both as current CEO of Cardio, right? So that's been great. And then we have people with more of that corporate experience from GE Healthcare and Medtronic and Philips, who can sort of help us understand and kind of tailor our messages to how the strategics think about things, right? So I think that's the challenges of being a CEO, is sort of listening to people who are way smarter than you and trying to synthesize something out of that, right? Yeah, overall, very knowledgeable and very humble bunch of advisors that we've been able to attract.
I love that. One of the biggest things we hear is, building a team that's smarter than you, better than you is the way to create an incredible business. So I love that from you. Other than the pivotal study, then, what other key milestones are you working towards over the next 12 to 24 months?
Yeah, so I mean, regulatory approval regulatory approvals in Europe and in the US will be the ones after the big HOSP-HF study. Again, we're quite lucky from an FDA perspective that we have a lot of clarity on what needs to be done, and a high certainty that we'll be able to accomplish those things. So there's very little regulatory uncertainty from our perspective. It's just about getting it done, right? And we need a little bit more data from this HOSP-HF study to get that. So we'll be submitting to the FDA towards the end of next year, and yeah, I mean, in 2027, it's showtime. So we'll be launching in the US, and after there, it's in many ways a new phase for the company, right? It's a new journey, transitioning out from a medical device development journey into a medical device commercialization journey, and I think we're all quite excited about that journey.
Amazing. And we're talking about the moonshot here. Everything goes smoothly, goes to plan, exceeds all expectations. Where do you envision their heart failure space if Acorai really does what it's meant to do?
Yeah, I mean, there's over 60 million heart failure patients worldwide. Wherever there is a heart failure patient, there is value to be had with Acorai. So we have the goal of becoming the new standard of heart failure management, right? So a new vital sign, if you will. And we're starting in the hospitalized heart failure patient workflow, but again, wherever there is a heart failure patient, we believe Acorai should be there as well.
Amazing. And do you see you guys expanding beyond heart failure in the future?
So we can. So I think
one problem at a time.
I think that is focus is key to success, I think. With that said, we do have a lot of flexibility with our device, in that it's a very sophisticated non-invasive sensing platform, and we know from the scientific literature that we can look at a whole range of other cardiac diseases, and whether that's coronary artery disease or heart arrhythmia or valvular disease or even pulmonary diseases such as COPD and pulmonary fibrosis. We could do that. So there is a version of the future where Acorai is effectively an app store, and we can leverage external algorithms on our platform, and if you're a physician, you can kind of pick and choose what you want and what you need exactly for your clinic. And this is before even talking about integrating large language models and all that kind of stuff, right? But I think heart failure is big enough for a long time, and I think focusing and getting that message and commercialization story right is our primary focus for the next few years.
Amazing. Well, look, you're building absolutely, an incredible company, incredible device, and a truly fascinating space. So kudos to you guys. What I would like to do is sort of round this off with advice to other people in the ecosystem and things that you've faced as a founder. So I guess, what's the biggest advice that you would give to other medtech founders from the cardiovascular space?
So I would advise common sense, because it gets you a long way, and not to be intimidated by the complexity that's been built into this industry. And a practical way of doing that is if you are try and stay in the R&D stage for as long as you can, and try and get the product as solid as you can, because it's from that foundation that the rest of the company will be built, and any redesign at a later stage will be very time consuming and costly because it needs to be done within the framework of medical device regulation and your quality management system, right? So try and stay in science project mode for as long as you can. I think that's one learning from our side. And take a first principles approach to how you go to the market and how you build your product, right? Listen to experts and listen to advisors, but understand their incentives or lack thereof. Advice is easy to give and hard to follow. So it's I think trusting your own gut and using common sense to drive your decisions is key.
Amazing. And any resources, programs, or communities that you think you could recommend that have been helpful to you as a founder?
Well, so Cedar Sinai Accelerator has been fantastic. So I would highly recommend applying for that. I think in Europe, again, the ERC Accelerator is a great grant and co-investment program, which is very selective and very time consuming to apply to, but it has had huge benefits for us. There was one fantastic program in the EU which doesn't exist anymore called EAT Health Gold Track, which was led by Steve Lakin at ACI in Boston, and I think that was a truly transformative experience for us. I'm not sure where we would have been without them, but unfortunately that no longer exists, so that's not very helpful advice. But Cedar Sinai Accelerator, and if you are in Europe, make the most of grants for as long as you can, because I think there's great opportunity to that.
Can't beat free money. Non-dilutive funding, hey?
There's three, right? There's a reporting structure. Oh, sorry. And the last thing I think is the Singaporean Chisel program, right? So the Center for Healthcare Innovation, they do a hospital test bedding program where they award up to 1 million Singaporean dollars worth of hospital test bedding with their major health systems, and we were lucky enough to receive this earlier this year in October, and that's been an excellent program so far, and it's very professionally run, and again, large buy-in from the decision makers and the stakeholders in that. So could highly recommend applying for that as well.
I've not heard of that initiative before. Very, very, very interesting. For me, then, the last part, I'm going to ask you a bit of a provocative question. What changes would you like to see to better support medtech innovation right now? And I'm going to ask you this about Europe, because there's a sticking point at the moment that, it's hard to get funding. Regulatory is hard with EU MDR. What do you think needs to change the most right now?
So I think Europe could take a lot of inspiration from the US in terms of prioritizing innovation and breakthrough technologies. So having a breakthrough device designation type of program in Europe would be highly beneficial, and providing streamlined access to those companies. The other, and this is where I think both the US and Europe could do better. That is offering transitional coverage, so reimbursement for emerging technologies or breakthrough device technologies, right? In the US, there is the TSET program, so the transitional coverage for emerging technologies, but it's only granted to 5 companies per year, right? So it's very selective. And I think broadening that out to provide greater clarity, at least temporary clarity on reimbursement and early revenue, would be a way to for startups to have greater visibility on revenues, which by extension will feed into greater investor appetite to fund those companies, right? Because there is a large medtech valley of death right now, where there is an absence of investors who want to take on that in between risk of from early prototype to regulatory approval. It is still quite difficult to get funded. It's always been difficult to get funded. That's why it's called the medtech valley of death. But I think figuring out ways to alleviate that valley and make it less steep and more shallow would be a way forward.
Well, what a way to finish it. Well, look, firstly, Filip, thank you very, very much for joining me on the show. And there's been some incredible insights to everyone that could listen to this, investors, people that are starting their own businesses, listeners from the cardiovascular space. So I can't thank you enough for your time. Any closing statements from your side? Anything you want to finish with, Filip?
No, I mean, keep innovating. If you're out there and you're considering quitting your job and starting a company, just do it. Because the healthcare space is bigger than all of us, and we need to do everything we can to help as many patients as possible.
Some wise words from Filip. Well, we'll leave it there, guys, and thank you for joining us. If there's one thing this space has taught me, both personally and professionally, it's that progress in cardiovascular care is never the result of one individual. It's built by ecosystems, by teams, by people willing to take the long bets on hard problems. At Crux, our mission is to support that ecosystem through talent, capital and community. The podcast is one small part of that effort, a place to share the real stories from people shaping the future of cardiovascular care. If you found value in today's conversation, I would love for you to follow the show and share it with someone building in this space. And if you're a founder, operator or investor working on something meaningful in the cardiovascular care space, we'd love to hear from you.